I never thought that the words spoken in a dimly lit living room would echo in my chest like a gunshot. But that night, my brother Michael leaned forward, his eyes sharp and cold, and hissed at me with a warning that cut deeper than any wound. "Stay quiet tonight, or I will make sure you regret it forever." My hands froze on the book I had been pretending to read, the air around me suddenly heavy, pressing down on my ribs until I could hardly breathe. I was 20 years old enough to think I could handle myself, but in that moment I felt as powerless as a child cornered in her own house. Before I go further, let me pause and ask you, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want you to hear this story and know that silence is not always safety. The house was quiet that evening, too quiet as though every wall and piece of furniture understood the threat that had just been planted like a ticking bomb. The lamps cast long shadows over the carpet, the refrigerator hummed in the distance, and upstairs I could hear the muffled sound of my father Richard watching television, a man who always claimed to be the protector of this family, but who had perfected the art of looking away. My mother Linda sat at the dining table scrolling through her phone with her reading glasses perched on her nose, and when Michael's threat cut through the room, she did not flinch. She did not defend me. She simply muttered that her son was joking. The dismissal burned worse than the words themselves. I wanted to scream, but the scream stayed trapped in my throat. The more I stared at Michael, the more I realized he was not joking. His jaw was clenched, his fist rested tight against the arm of the chair, and his gaze was locked on me with a mix of menace and satisfaction. He enjoyed seeing me shrink back into silence. He enjoyed the control. My pulse thundered so loudly that it drowned the ordinary noises of the house. Every creak of the floor above sounded like a drumbeat, every tick of the clock like a countdown to something I could not name. I told myself to breathe slowly, but each inhale was ragged, each exhale broken. Michael leaned back, stretched his arms, and gave me a smile that looked more like a blade. "Remember, Anna, stay quiet," he said again, softer this time, like a lullaby that promised ruin. I nodded without meaning to, my body betraying me, giving him the satisfaction he wanted, but inside my chest something twisted, a seed of defiance curling and stretching against the weight of years of fear. I wanted to believe that if I kept my mouth shut, the night would pass and nothing would happen, but I had lived under this roof long enough to know that silence never protected me. Silence only fed the hunger of those who thrived on control. As the evening deepened, the house seemed to close in on me. I retreated to my room, clutching my phone like a lifeline, my mind racing with images of what might unfold. Would he come after me in the dark? Would he corner me in the hallway? Or worse, would he punish me by turning the entire family against me once again? The toxic cycle replayed in my head like a film I could never stop. Childhood memories rose uninvited, Michael shoving me against the fence when I was 10, Linda telling me I was too dramatic when I cried, Richard shaking his head and leaving the room. Always the same pattern. My pain, their silence, his power. That night, though, something was different. His warning felt heavier, sharper, almost as if it was attached to something larger, something waiting outside the walls. I sat on my bed, staring at the window, the street lamp outside, flickering like an eye that refused to close. I heard my mother's laughter downstairs at a television show, my father's chair creaking, Michael pacing across the living room floor. Each sound tightened the coil of dread in my stomach. I wanted to call my friend Sophia to tell her everything, but the memory of Michael's voice stopped me. "Stay quiet." The words pressed against my ribs like cold steel. I picked up my journal instead and scribbled down the sentence, "Stay quiet tonight, or I will make sure you regret it forever." The ink smeared as my hand shook, but writing it gave me a strange strength. If I could put his threat on paper, then maybe I could also put an end to the power he held over me. Still, fear gnawed at the edges of my determination. What if he meant it? What if this night would not end with simple intimidation, but with something irreversible? I looked at the clock. It was barely 7:30. Hours stretched ahead like an endless hallway. The thought of surviving until morning felt impossible. At one point, Michael walked past my door, his steps slow, deliberate, dragging across the wood floor like a predator circling prey. I held my breath until his shadow slipped away. My heart did not slow. It galloped in my chest, wild and terrified. I pressed my back against the wall, wishing I could disappear into the plaster. I whispered to myself that I just needed to hold on. I just needed to outlast this night. But deep down, I knew that nothing about this was ordinary. His threat was not a bluff, it was a promise. And I could feel the night sharpening around me, preparing to prove just how serious he was. If you are listening, understand this danger does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of family. Sometimes it speaks in the voice you grew up with, and sometimes the most terrifying threats are whispered in the places you are supposed to feel safest. That night, I learned that survival is not about staying quiet. It is about daring to recognize when silence is the trap. That night, my brother's words set in motion events that would unravel every illusion I had about family loyalty and safety. At 7 o'clock, I was a college student coming home from work, tired and hopeful that I could get through another evening under this roof. By midnight, I would be crouched by my window, shaking so hard I could hardly hold my phone, staring at shadows in the driveway, praying I could keep breathing long enough to protect myself. By dawn, nothing in my life would ever be the same. And it all began with a single threat spoken by someone who should have been my protector, but who chose to become my predator instead. My name is Anna Thompson, and I am 20 years old. When people see me on the street or at the university where I study nursing, they see a young woman with books in her arms, a determined stride, and perhaps a smile ready for anyone polite enough to nod in my direction. What they do not see is the heavy shadow that follows me home each evening, the shadow shaped not by strangers, but by the very people who share my last name. I live in a suburban neighborhood that looks perfectly normal to outsiders. The lawns are trimmed, the mailboxes stand in neat rows. Children ride their bikes after dinner, and neighbors wave as they water their gardens. It is the kind of place that promises safety and comfort. But inside the Thompson household, safety is an illusion that crumbles the moment the front door shuts. My father, Richard, is 50 years old and the kind of man who believes authority is the only language worth speaking. He was once proud of his job in construction management, but years of disappointments have left him bitter. His presence fills a room with silence rather than warmth. He insists he loves his family. Yet when conflict erupts, he withdraws into his armchair with a glass of whiskey, leaving words of violence hanging in the air without challenge. My mother, Linda, is 45, refined in her appearance, always in pressed blouses and neat hair. But beneath the appearance lies a heart that chose convenience over courage. She tells herself she keeps peace in the house, yet her way of keeping peace is to silence me, to tell me I am too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. Every time Michael lashes out, she turns to me with weary eyes and says he does not mean it, that boys are like that I should not provoke him. The cruelty of her denial has cut deeper than Michael's fists ever did. Then there is Michael himself. At 24, he should be building a life of his own, finding work, pursuing dreams, maybe even protecting his younger sister. Instead, he has remained in the house like a storm cloud that never moves. To neighbors, he is polite, even charming. He helps carry groceries, shovel snow for Mrs. Callahan next door, and smiles easily. But inside the walls of our home, he is different. His eyes narrow with suspicion at every word I say. His hands find excuses to push, to grab, to remind me of his strength. He thrives on control, on knowing that my silence feeds his power. I have memories of him that stretch back to childhood. I remember being 10 years old, clutching my homework folder when he yanked it from my hands and tossed it into a puddle just because I had dared to correct his pronunciation. I remember being 12 and locked outside in the rain while my parents told me to stop crying because I was disturbing the neighbors. These moments stitched together a childhood where love should have been, and by the time I was a teenager, I understood that in this house my role was not to speak, but to endure. College was supposed to be my escape. Nursing appealed to me because it was about healing, about caring about building something good out of pain. I took night classes, I worked shifts at the local diner, and I told myself that once I graduated, I would have a job that paid enough to leave this house forever. Yet no matter how late I stayed out eventually, I had to come home. And home meant facing Michael, facing Linda's indifference, facing Richard's silence. The pattern never broke. My closest ally has been Sophia Miller, my classmate. She is bright, outspoken, unafraid of confrontation. She has invited me many times to crash at her apartment, but pride and fear kept me tethered to my family. Pride, because I believed I could endure fear, because I knew that leaving would unleash Michael's fury in ways I could not predict. Across the street lives Mr. Howard, a man in his mid-50s with a weathered face and steady eyes. I only knew him in passing a polite nod at the mailbox until the night everything changed. He carries himself like someone who has seen darkness before and refuses to be blinded by it again. I would later learn that he was once a police officer, retired now, but still alert to the details others ignore. At the time, though, he was just another neighbor in a quiet street. I never guessed he would become one of the few people willing to stand beside me. As I sat on my bed that night after Michael's warning, I thought about each of these people. My father upstairs, his television volume raised to drown out responsibility. My mother in the dining room, her glasses slipping down her nose as she chose to see nothing. My brother in the living room, his smirk resting like a brand on my memory. And outside, neighbors who believed we were ordinary. The contrast made me ache. To the world, the Thompsons were respectable. To me, the Thompsons were a cage. I thought about my dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping patients, of one day working in an emergency ward where quick action could save lives. How ironic I thought that I could save strangers but not myself. The textbooks on my desk glowed in the lamplight, their pages filled with knowledge of anatomy, of healing, of resilience. They looked like relics from a future I was desperate to reach, but unsure I would survive to see. At 20, I should have been worrying about exams, about whether to attend a campus dance, about finding a part-time job that paid more than tips. Instead, I was rehearsing how to stay alive under my own roof. And yet, in the middle of despair, there flickered a stubborn ember. Maybe it came from Sophia's voice in my ear, telling me I was stronger than I believed. Maybe it came from the quiet nods of Mr. Howard, who seemed to notice the shadows behind my eyes. Or maybe it came from within me, from the little girl who had cried in the rain and been told to stop. That little girl had grown up, and though fear still gripped her, she was no longer willing to be erased. This background, this family history, it is important because without it you might not understand why Michael's threat carried such weight, why the silence that evening felt so suffocating, and why I could sense that something more sinister than usual was brewing. It was not just another night in the Thompson household. It was the night when years of unspoken abuse began to splinter, when the mask of normalcy cracked, when the truth prepared to reveal itself. If you are listening to this story, know that behind every ordinary house with trimmed hedges, there can be secrets that corrode from within. Mine was not unique, but it was mine, and it was about to erupt in ways I could never have imagined. It was close to 10 o'clock that night when the house settled into its usual routine of tension disguised as calm. My father, Richard, had retreated upstairs with his drink, my mother. Linda remained in the dining room with her phone, and Michael sprawled across the couch with the television flickering in front of him. I slipped into the kitchen with my phone pressed against my ear, whispering to Sophia about the plan I had been quietly building for months. I told her that I could not keep living like this, that I was saving every dollar from my shifts at the diner, that soon I would have enough for a small place of my own. Sophia's voice came through the speaker with encouragement and warmth. She said she would help me find an apartment, that she had already spoken to a landlord near campus. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. I lowered my voice, leaning against the counter, my eyes darting to make sure Michael was still absorbed in the television. But Michael's ears had always been sharp when it came to my secrets. His head turned suddenly, and before I could end the call, his voice sliced across the room. "What did you just say?" My stomach clenched. I tried to cover the phone to tell Sophia I would call back, but Michael was already standing. His height cast a shadow over the kitchen light as he stepped closer. He snatched the phone from my hand and glanced at the screen. "Sophia Miller," he muttered with disdain before pressing the button to end the call. He dropped the phone on the counter and leaned toward me, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can just leave Anna? You think you can walk out and forget this family?" His words struck like blows. I tried to speak to explain that I only wanted independence, but he slammed his palm against the counter, silencing me. My father's footsteps creaked on the stairs, then stopped, then retreated, leaving me alone with Michael's rage. My mother peeked in from the dining room doorway, sighed, and said softly, "He's only joking," before turning back to her phone. My jaw tightened with disbelief. How could she call this a joke when his face was twisted with real anger? Michael's voice dropped into a low growl. "Stay here, Anna. Do what you're told. If you walk away from us, if you try to betray this family, you'll regret it more than anything in your life." His words chilled me to the bone. I realized that his earlier warning in the living room was not a moment of frustration, it was a declaration of war. He wanted me silent, trapped, obedient. I felt my pulse thundering as he leaned so close I could feel the heat of his breath. "Stay quiet tonight, or I will make sure you disappear from this house in a way no one will forget." The room spun. I forced myself to remain still, but my fingers trembled against the counter. In that instant, I understood that I needed proof, something beyond my word against his, something that would expose him if he ever tried to claim he had been joking. I glanced at my phone still on the counter. My hands moved without hesitation. I tapped the record button before lifting it, holding it casually at my side, as though I was too nervous to put it away. Michael's voice continued spilling threats and accusations. He spoke of how weak I was, how ungrateful, how the family had given me everything, and how dare I try to leave. Each sentence dripped with venom, but each one was captured by the phone's microphone. My father remained upstairs, willfully deaf. My mother muttered that I should listen to him, that family mattered more than pride. The betrayal in her tone burned. I wanted to shout, to demand that she protect me, but instead I stayed silent, letting Michael's words fill the recording. My silence was no longer obedience, it was strategy. At last, he stepped back, shaking his head as though disgusted by my lack of response. He tossed the remote on the couch and muttered, "You'll see what happens if you try anything." Then he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me rooted to the floor, my chest heaving. I pressed stop on the recording and stared at the file saved on my phone. My heart pounded with both fear and relief. I had something solid now, something he could not deny, but the weight of what he had said pressed heavily against me. He was serious. The danger was not imagined. The toxic silence of my parents only made his threats stronger. Alone in the kitchen, I whispered to myself, "This cannot continue." I pressed the phone to my chest as though clutching it would protect me. Upstairs, my father's television grew louder, drowning out the tension. My mother's laughter floated from the dining room as she watched a video online. Life in the house pretended to go on as normal, but I knew the truth. Normal had shattered the moment Michael made his threats. The clock struck 10 each chime, hammering against my nerves. I thought of Sophia waiting for me to call back, unaware of the storm that had just erupted. I thought of my younger self, locked outside in the rain, told by my mother to stop crying. I thought of how every warning I had ever received from Michael had escalated into something worse. This one felt different, heavier, final. In that moment, I made a vow to myself. I would no longer pretend his words were empty. I would no longer allow my mother's excuses or my father's silence to erase my reality. I had captured his voice, his threat, and I would hold on to it as a weapon. Fear surged in waves, but beneath the fear, something stronger pulsed. Determination. This was the beginning, the first step toward a fight I had not chosen, but one I could no longer avoid. When I finally returned to my room, I locked the door and slid the phone under my pillow. My body shook as I sat on the bed, but my mind was sharp. I knew that whatever Michael planned for that night, I had to stay alert, I had to survive, and I had to be ready to act. The clock crept past 11, and the walls of the Thompson house seemed to lean closer, pressing down on me as if they too were waiting for something to happen. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone clutched in my hand, the recording of Michael's threat hidden safely in its memory. But safety felt like a distant concept. The night stretched before me like a long, dark corridor with no end in sight. My window faced the street, and through the glass I could see the soft glow of the lamppost and the shadow of the old oak tree swaying in the wind. The air outside looked calm, but inside my chest was a storm that would not settle. I tried to focus on my textbooks, flipping pages without seeing the words. My mind replayed Michael's voice over and over, each repetition heavier than the last. "Stay quiet tonight, or else." The phrase coiled itself around my ribs until breathing felt like a struggle. I rose and paced the room, my bare feet silent on the carpet, my eyes darting to the door every time the floor creaked in the hallway. Downstairs, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional cough from my mother, who was probably still glued to her phone. My father's television echoed faintly from upstairs, muffled by distance, but loud enough to remind me that he was still there, still choosing ignorance over action. The normalcy of those sounds clashed violently with the panic racing through me. I pressed my palms to my ears and tried to drown them out, but the silence that followed was worse, filled with the pounding of my heart and the whisper of my breath. I turned toward my dresser where a framed photo of my childhood stood. It showed me at 6 years old, smiling with missing teeth, sitting on my mother's lap. Her arms circled me loosely, her smile stiff. I stared at it now and wondered how much of her warmth had been real, how much had been duty. The memory that surfaced was not of laughter, but of the day Michael had shoved me against that same dresser years later, my mother telling me afterward that brothers roughhoused and I should toughen up. The sting of that dismissal returned with full force, and I pressed the photo face down on the wood. A shiver ran through me, though the heater hummed steadily. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket around my shoulders like armor, but the blanket offered no comfort. My body felt heavy with dread, yet sleep refused to come. I closed my eyes, and every flicker of light from the street became a phantom movement. Every creak of the floorboards became a step drawing nearer. My mind wove images of Michael standing at my door, opening it quietly, leaning over me as I slept. I opened my eyes again, gasping, only to find the room empty, shadows stretching harmlessly across the walls. I sat upright, hugging my knees, whispering to myself that I was safe, that I had proof that morning would come. But deep down, I did not believe those reassurances. The air was thick, charged like the moments before a storm breaks. Around 12:30, exhaustion finally pulled me into a shallow doze, my head nodding against the wall. I dreamed of water rising around me, cold and relentless, and Michael's voice above it telling me to stay quiet as the tide reached my chin. I jolted awake, my skin damp with sweat. That was when I heard a faint scraping sound outside. I froze, my breath caught. At first, I thought it was a trash can rolling in the wind, but then it came again, sharper metal against pavement. I rose and crept toward the window, careful not to let the floor creak. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. My stomach twisted instantly. Two figures crouched near the driveway, their movements deliberate. One held something that glinted under the street lamp, catching a shard of light before vanishing into shadow. My pulse roared in my ears. I leaned closer, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, straining to see. Then I understood. They were dragging a blade across rubber. My car usually sat right there in the driveway, and if it had been its tires, would now be shredded. But tonight, I had parked it down the street after Michael's earlier warning unsettled me. The realization hit me like ice. Michael's threat, his insistence on silence, it had not been empty bravado. Something larger was unfolding. My breath hitched as I watched one of the men reach into a bag and pull out a small container. The liquid he poured shimmered as it spread, and even through the closed window, I thought I caught the sharp tang that made my chest seize. Gasoline. My fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped the curtain. They were not just vandalizing, they were preparing for something far worse. I stumbled back from the window, clutching my phone. Fear clawed at my throat, but a sliver of clarity cut through it. I had to act. My hands shook as I dialed the numbers blurring on the screen, but somehow I managed to press call. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, and I whispered into the phone, barely moving my lips. "There are men outside my house. They are pouring something in the driveway. Please send help." She asked questions, her tone steady, guiding me to give details. I answered as best I could, my words broken by the pounding of my pulse. She told me officers were on their way and urged me to stay hidden. I crouched beside the window again, phone pressed to my ear, knees trembling so hard they ached. The men outside moved with unnerving calm, as if they had rehearsed this before. One flicked open a lighter, testing the flame before snapping it shut. The tiny spark lit the night for an instant, and I bit down on a cry. My chest heaved, sweat dampened my palms, and every instinct screamed at me to grab my bag and run. But then I thought of Michael. Where was he? Had he gone outside earlier? Was he part of this? The thought made my skin crawl. I pulled myself away from the window and crept toward the stairs. My legs carried me up to the second floor, where my parents' bedroom door was shut, their silence louder than any scream. I whispered to the dispatcher, "My parents are here, but they are not helping. My brother is dangerous. Please hurry." The dispatcher told me again to stay calm. Her voice was an anchor, but the house felt like it was sinking. I tiptoed back to my room, stuffed a few essentials into a backpack, my movements clumsy with panic. I packed my charger, my wallet, and a sweater. I grabbed the stuffed bear that Sophia had once given me, silly maybe, but holding it steadied me for a moment. I returned to the window just in time to see the figures shifting nervously, the lighter flashing again. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Please hurry, they are about to do it." The dispatcher assured me that help was close, but minutes dragged like hours. Every tick of the clock was torture. Then faint in the distance, I saw headlights turning the corner. Red and blue lights followed, washing across the street, growing brighter. Relief and terror crashed together inside me. Help was here, but the confrontation was about to ignite. My body trembled as I crouched low, watching, praying the men would be stopped before the spark reached the gasoline. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night like a sudden storm, scattering shadows across the street and flooding the Thompson driveway in harsh illumination. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched by the window, clutching the phone so tightly that my knuckles ached. The dispatcher's voice told me to stay hidden, that officers were already outside, but my body trembled with fear that the spark of that lighter might ignite before the police could stop them. The two figures froze for only a heartbeat, then chaos exploded. One dropped the container and bolted toward the narrow path between houses. The other lingered with the lighter still in his grip, his hand trembling as if torn between running and finishing what he started. A voice boomed from the cruiser's loudspeaker. "Drop it now! Hands where we can see them!" The man hesitated, flicking the lighter open, and the tiny flame glowed against the darkness. My heart stopped. For a moment, I thought I was about to watch fire engulf everything, but then one of the officers tackled him hard to the ground, the lighter clattering harmlessly onto the pavement. I sagged against the wall, tears streaming down my face, relief crashing over me so violently that my knees gave out. I whispered into the phone, "Thank you, thank you," and the dispatcher calmly reassured me that everything was under control. Yet even as relief spread, another thought pierced through. Where was Michael? I pulled back from the window and crept toward the stairs, each step slow, my ears straining for sounds inside the house. My parents' door remained shut, the television still murmuring. They had not come out, had not reacted. Their silence was its own betrayal. I descended into the living room, the glow of the police lights seeping through the curtains, painting the furniture in surreal colors. That was when I noticed the garage door slightly ajar. My breath quickened. I padded closer, pushed it open, and flicked the switch. The overhead light buzzed to life, casting a pale glow over the cluttered space. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just boxes stacked high, tools hanging on the wall, and the faint smell of oil. But then my eyes landed on the jacket crumpled in the corner, the one Michael had been wearing earlier that evening. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening, and that was when I saw the dark stains across the sleeve. My chest tightened. The stains looked like blood, faint but undeniable. My hands shook as I reached out with a tissue and dabbed the fabric. The color smeared, confirming my fear. My mind raced. Had Michael been outside before the police arrived? Was he connected to those men? Why else would his jacket be hidden like this? Behind me, the door creaked and I spun, heart leaping into my throat. Standing there in the dim light was Mr. Howard, our neighbor from across the street. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set, and for a moment I felt both fear and relief. He held up his hands quickly. Easy, Anna. I just came over to check. The police asked if anyone inside needed help. I told them I thought you might. His presence steadied me, though my body still shook. I pointed to the jacket, my voice breaking as I whispered, "Look." He stepped forward, crouched, and examined the stains with practiced eyes. His expression hardened. "This isn't nothing," he murmured. "Where's your brother?" My lips parted, but no words came. I didn't know. Upstairs, maybe. Or outside. Mr. Howard's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he said, "You need to be careful. If he's involved in this, you could be in more danger than you realize." My throat tightened. I nodded slowly, pressing the tissue into a plastic bag I found nearby. Evidence, I thought, though the word made my stomach twist. Mr. Howard guided me back into the house, his movements calm, protective. He whispered that he would talk to the officers that I should stay in my room for now. But before he left, he fixed me with a steady look. "Don't ignore what you saw. Your instincts are right." Then he slipped out, leaving me trembling in the hallway. I climbed the stairs on shaky legs, the plastic bag clutched in my hand. My parents' door was still closed, their silence deafening. I entered my room and locked the door, sliding the bag under my bed. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Are you okay?" I typed quickly. "Not safe. I'll call you tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting it aside. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Images looped endlessly. Michael's glare, the gasoline glistening on the pavement, the spark of the lighter, the bloodstains on the jacket. I pressed my hands to my face and whispered to myself that I had to hold on, that I had to be smart. At some point, the night slipped into uneasy silence. The flashing lights outside dimmed as the police finished their work. The voices faded and the street returned to stillness. But inside me, nothing was calm. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until dawn painted faint stripes of light across the wall. When I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, it was filled with dreams of fire and Michael's voice echoing, "Stay quiet." The morning came with the smell of coffee drifting from downstairs, ordinary and cruel in its normalcy. I descended to the kitchen to find my mother at the table sipping from her mug as though nothing had happened. She looked up briefly, her expression impatient. "You look terrible. Did you stay up all night worrying about nonsense again?" My chest tightened. I opened my mouth to mention the jacket, but her glare silenced me. Richard entered a moment later, reading the paper, his face blank. Neither of them spoke of the police, of the flashing lights, of the danger that had unfolded just outside. Their silence was deliberate, suffocating. Michael appeared last freshly showered, wearing a clean shirt, his eyes sharp, but his smile infuriatingly calm. "Morning," he said casually, pouring himself coffee. My hand clenched around the chair back. He acted as though the night had been a dream, as though his jacket wasn't hidden in the garage with stains I could not ignore. I studied his face, searching for cracks, but he remained composed, his gaze meeting mine with a challenge. I forced myself to look away, but inside I repeated a vow. I would not let this vanish into silence. The discovery of that jacket, of those stains, was more than coincidence. It was the thread that could unravel everything. I just had to find the strength to pull it. Morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, but it did nothing to soften the weight pressing on my chest. The discovery of Michael's jacket with its stains haunted me with every breath. I had hidden the plastic bag under my bed, but the knowledge of it burned in my mind like a secret I could not escape. I ate nothing at breakfast, the taste of food ash in my mouth, while my parents carried on as though the night before had been perfectly ordinary. Richard rustled his newspaper, and Linda reminded Michael to take out the trash. Their silence about the flashing lights, the police, the commotion outside, was not forgetfulness. It was deliberate, an agreement to erase reality. When I opened my mouth to speak, Linda's eyes cut into me sharp and cold. "Do not start, Anna," she said. "We will not have this again." My father lowered the paper just long enough to add, "Enough accusations. We keep peace in this house." My hands clenched in my lap. Peace, I thought bitterly, was their word for submission, their word for my silence. Michael leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee with a smirk. He glanced at me like a cat watching a trapped bird. The sight made my stomach twist. I excused myself and returned to my room, slamming the door harder than I intended. Minutes later, there was a knock. Linda entered without waiting for permission. She closed the door behind her and stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "If you keep accusing your brother, you will destroy this family," she hissed. "Do you understand? Your words carry consequences. Do not be so foolish." My chest tightened. "Destroy this family." The phrase echoed in my head, as though Michael's actions were not the danger, but my voice. I wanted to shout that it was already destroyed, that it had been crumbling for years, but the words stuck in my throat. Linda's eyes softened only briefly. "You exaggerate," she said, brushing invisible dust from her blouse. "Michael has his flaws, but he loves you. He protects us. Do not twist things." She left as quickly as she had entered, leaving me with the echo of her gaslighting. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text appeared from an unknown number. "Keep quiet or you'll regret it." The words seared into me like fire. My hands shook as I held the phone, staring at the message. I did not know if it came from Michael or someone connected to the men outside, but either way, the warning was clear. My breath grew shallow, my vision blurred. I sat on the bed, clutching the phone, whispering to myself that I was not crazy, that danger was real. But the house conspired against me. My parents' denial, Michael's smirk, the text, all combined to make me feel like a ghost drifting through my own life. I tried to call Sophia but hung up before she answered. What could I say that would not sound hysterical? That my brother was dangerous, that my parents chose blindness, that shadows lurked in our driveway. She would believe me, I knew she would, but the thought of dragging her into this nightmare filled me with guilt. I curled under the blanket, pressing my face into the pillow, the memory of Michael's warning whispering through my skull. Stay quiet. Silence stretched across the hours. The house grew colder, though the heater hummed. I wandered the hallway like a prisoner, each door a barrier. My father's closed, my mother's closed, Michael's door slightly ajar with laughter spilling from his phone. I caught a glimpse of him lounging on his bed, smiling at something on the screen, unconcerned, untouchable. My body shook with rage. How could he rest so easily while I lived in fear? I retreated quickly before he saw me, my heart pounding. In the bathroom, I splashed water on my face, stared into the mirror, and saw not the young woman I wanted to be, but a hollow reflection carved by years of fear. For a moment, I thought of smashing the mirror, of letting shards fall like proof of my breaking, but I stopped myself. Proof, I reminded myself, needed to be precise, not reckless. Still, loneliness settled like a weight I could not throw off. Even Mr. Howard's steady gaze from the night before felt distant, as though the safety he represented belonged to someone else. The text message echoed louder in the silence. "Keep quiet or you'll regret it." My knees buckled and I slid to the floor, curling against the wall, whispering over and over that I was not insane, that this was real, that I had to hold on. Yet in that isolation, I understood how victims break. Not because they stop believing in danger, but because they start doubting their right to name it. My family wanted me erased. Michael wanted me controlled. The unknown sender wanted me silenced. All forces pressed in, trying to make me vanish into doubt. But somewhere in the depths of fear, a small ember still glowed. I remembered Sophia's encouragement, Mr. Howard's words, the recording on my phone, the stained jacket under my bed. I had fragments of truth. If I could hold them together long enough, maybe I could survive the storm. The day dragged on in heavy silence, each hour slow and suffocating. My parents barely spoke to me. Michael smirked each time our eyes met, and the text on my phone remained unanswered. By evening, I felt like a ghost drifting through my own life. Yet as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself that ghosts do not gather evidence, ghosts do not fight back. Tomorrow I would begin. Tonight I would endure. The morning after that crushing isolation, I woke with determination lodged in my chest like a stone. The fear had not vanished, but something had shifted during the long hours of darkness. I understood now that my silence was exactly what Michael and my parents depended on. If I wanted freedom, I could not simply run. I needed proof, undeniable, solid enough to shatter the facade they had built for years. I called Sophia as soon as I stepped outside the house, my voice low and urgent. She listened without interruption as I described the threat, the jacket, the text, the silence of my parents. When I finished, she exhaled sharply and said, "Anna, you cannot keep this inside. You need evidence. You need to protect yourself." I admitted that I had already started that I had the recording of Michael's threats. She told me that was the first brick in the wall I had to build. Her confidence steadied me. That evening when I returned home, I walked directly to the living room, pretending to adjust the books on the shelf, and slipped a small camera into a gap between them. Sophia had given it to me, a tiny device easily hidden. My hands shook, but I forced myself to smile as Michael passed through the room, oblivious. The camera would capture sound and video. It felt like a lifeline. Over the next days, I added to my arsenal. I dug out old journals filled with entries about nights when Michael hit me, about mornings when my mother called me dramatic, about afternoons when my father shook his head and left me bleeding. I photographed the pages and stored them on a flash drive Sophia had given me. I took pictures of bruises still fading on my arms, scars I had long hidden under sleeves. It was painful, like reopening wounds, but I told myself that each image was a weapon against the silence. Mr. Howard noticed me walking back from class one afternoon, my shoulders heavy with the weight of secrecy. He invited me onto his porch, and after a long pause, I confessed fragments of what was happening. His eyes sharpened, his expression grim. He had seen men like Michael before, he said, and he knew the patterns. He advised me to keep everything documented carefully, to make backups, to store them outside the house if possible. His steady voice anchored me. For the first time, I felt like someone believed me without hesitation. That night, the camera caught Michael pacing in the living room, phone pressed to his ear. I listened with my heart pounding as his voice spilled into the tiny device. "She'll stay silent." I made sure of it. The words froze my blood, but also fueled my resolve. I transferred the file onto the flash drive and locked it in my backpack. Another brick in the wall. Meanwhile, Linda's behavior grew sharper. She accused me of being distant, of stirring conflict. At dinner, she said coldly, "You are obsessed with painting your brother as a monster. This family will not survive your lies." Richard grunted in agreement, his eyes never leaving his plate. Michael smirked at me across the table, knowing my parents shielded him. My appetite vanished, but I forced myself to swallow a few bites, pretending calm, while inside, fury blazed. Later, I retreated to my room and whispered into the dark, "I am not crazy. I am not alone. I have proof." Days blurred into one another. Each moment was filled with fear that Michael would discover the camera or the files, but also with a strange empowerment. Every new piece of evidence felt like a step toward freedom. Sophia checked in constantly, reminding me to stay strong. She offered to hide the flash drive at her apartment. I gave it to her with shaking hands, relieved to know the information existed beyond the walls of the Thompson house. One evening, I returned home to find Michael sitting in the garage, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low tones. I hid behind the doorframe, recording with my own phone. He said words that made my skin crawl. "She thinks she can leave." "Don't worry, I'll handle it." That phrase, captured on audio, became another shard of truth. I sent the file to Sophia immediately. The weight of secrecy was crushing, but the act of gathering evidence gave me purpose. Each night I reviewed the camera recordings. Each day I scribbled in my journal every detail, a potential thread in the tapestry of truth I was weaving. Still, danger lingered. Michael's temper flared more often. He slammed doors, muttered threats under his breath, and one night he cornered me in the hallway, his voice low. "You remember what I said, right? Stay quiet." My hands trembled, but I met his eyes and said nothing, letting the silence shield the tiny recorder in my pocket. His grin widened, mistaking my silence for submission. But I knew better. I was no longer his victim. I was his witness. Mr. Howard continued to watch discreetly. He once slipped me a note that read, "Be cautious, but keep going. You are stronger than you think." I folded the note into my journal, holding on to it as a reminder that someone outside these walls saw me, believed me. By the end of the week, I had gathered hours of recordings, photographs, texts, and journal entries. Each piece was a drop, but together they formed a tide. The isolation still gnawed at me, my parents' accusations still cut deep, but the evidence kept me steady. I understood now that survival was not just enduring. Survival was building a case so strong that even their silence could not bury it. One night, I sat on my bed, the flash drive safely in Sophia's possession, my phone filled with backups, and whispered into the darkness. Michael, you told me to stay quiet, but my silence is not submission. It is strategy. And when the time comes, the truth will be louder than your threats. The night that marked the beginning of the end came without warning. The day had passed in dull silence, each family member moving through the house like actors in a play rehearsed too many times. My father muttered about bills, my mother scrolled endlessly through her phone, and Michael lounged in the living room with a smug ease that made my skin crawl. By midnight, the house had fallen into stillness again, but I could not sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of wood and whisper of wind. Then, around 1 a.m, the scream pierced the night. It came from the house next door, sharp, desperate, and cut off too quickly. I jolted upright, heart-hammering, and rushed to the window. The street lamp glowed dimly, casting stretched shadows across the pavement. I caught sight of movement, a figure slipping along the fence-lined shoes, dragging through mud. My eyes narrowed as I recognized the shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. Michael. He moved quickly, glancing around before disappearing into the side yard of our own house. My stomach lurched. I pressed my forehead against the glass, my breath fogging the surface. Moments later, the front door eased open, and he stepped inside, careful, quiet, as though he did not want anyone to know he had been gone. But I saw it. His shoes glistened with wet mud, streaked dark up the sides. I pulled back from the window, my pulse racing, and fumbled for my phone. My fingers trembled so badly that it took 3 tries to unlock the screen. I opened the small camera app hidden on my device and pointed it toward the stairs just as Michael crept past. The footage caught his shoes, the mud, his nervous glance over his shoulder. It was not much, but it was something. A moment later, a shadow shifted outside. I peered back through the window and saw Mr. Howard standing across the street, half concealed by the trunk of the oak tree. His eyes scanned the houses, his body rigid. He had heard the scream too. Our gazes met across the darkness, and he raised a hand in a subtle signal that told me he understood. Relief coursed through me. I was not alone. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Police cars idled near the house next door, officers speaking with the shaken residents. I stood at the window watching while my parents pretended nothing unusual was happening. Richard grumbled about the noise. Linda shook her head and muttered that people exaggerated. Michael remained silent, his eyes darting occasionally toward me with a flicker of something almost like fear. Later that day, officers knocked on our door, asking if we had heard anything unusual during the night. My father said no immediately, my mother echoed him, and Michael shrugged. When the officers looked at me, my throat tightened. For a moment, I thought of staying quiet, of letting my parents' script play out. But then I remembered the jacket hidden in my room, the recordings, the video of Michael's shoes. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Linda's voice cut through sharp and accusing. My daughter imagines things, she said quickly. She is dramatic. She makes trouble. My jaw clenched, my chest aching with fury. The officers glanced between us, their expressions unreadable, then thanked us for our time and left. As the door shut behind them, Linda turned on me, her face pale with rage. "You will not ruin your brother's life," she snapped. "You will not destroy this family with your stories." Michael stood behind her. Arms crossed, his smirk taunting. Something in me hardened. I did not answer her. I simply walked upstairs, shut my door, and pulled out the flash drive Sophia had returned to me the day before. I stared at it in my palm, feeling its weight. The truth was no longer just mine. It was documented, recorded, undeniable. That evening, I met Sophia at a cafe near campus. I handed her the flash drive and told her everything from the scream in the night to the mud on Michael's shoes. She listened with fierce focus, then said firmly, "Anna, this has to go to the police. We need to find someone who will listen, someone who will not dismiss you." My eyes filled with tears of both fear and relief. She was right. The web of silence woven by my parents was strong, but it could not stretch beyond our walls forever. When I returned home, Michael was waiting in the hallway, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. He leaned close as I passed, whispering, "You think you are clever. Remember what I said. Stay quiet." His breath was hot against my ear, but instead of shrinking back, I met his gaze with steady eyes. For the first time, he faltered just for a second, and I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. That was when I knew the tide was shifting. He sensed it too. The truth was slipping out of his grasp, and soon it would break free completely. The trial was set 2 months later, but the days leading up to it felt like years compressed into hours. Each moment stretched taut with anticipation and dread. Sophia walked beside me through every step, reminding me that my voice mattered, that silence had kept me prisoner, but truth could set me free. Mr. Howard prepared his own testimony. His footage of Michael sneaking back into the house that night carefully handed over to investigators. My journals, my recordings, the photos of bruises, and the audio clips of threats all compiled into a file too heavy to be ignored. When the day finally came, the courthouse loomed above me, gray stone against a cold sky, its steps echoing with the shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices. I clutched the strap of my bag so tightly that my knuckles whitened. Inside, the hallways smelled of paper and coffee, the buzz of lawyers and clerks swirling around me. My lawyer, David Carter, a man with calm eyes and steady hands, greeted me with a reassuring nod. He told me we were ready, that the case was strong, that I only needed to tell the truth. The courtroom itself felt like another world. Wooden benches lined the sides, the judge's bench rising above the seal of justice glaring down from the wall. Michael sat at the defense table in a crisp suit that did nothing to hide the arrogance in his eyes. His smirk flickered as I entered, but I saw something else beneath it this time: nervousness. Linda sat behind him, her lips pressed tight, while Richard avoided my gaze entirely, staring at the floor as though the wood grain was suddenly fascinating. The proceedings began, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made my stomach churn. The prosecutor outlined the case, describing years of intimidation, escalating threats, and the violent night that shattered the illusion of safety. Each word pressed against me like a weight, but also like a promise that the truth was finally being spoken aloud. When it was my turn to testify, my legs shook as I walked to the witness stand. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down, gripping the edges of the chair. The room blurred for a moment, my vision clouded with fear, but then I looked at Sophia sitting in the gallery, her eyes steady, her head nodding slightly, and I breathed. My voice began soft, describing my childhood, the years of Michael's dominance, the dismissals from my parents. The courtroom listened, the silence heavy, every ear tuned to the unraveling of a family's carefully guarded secret. I played the first recording, Michael's voice filling the room. "Stay quiet tonight, or else." The words crackled through the speaker, undeniable, chilling. Gasps rippled through the benches. I described the night of the scream, the mud on his shoes, the jacket stained and hidden in the garage. Then came the camera footage, Michael's voice again saying, "She'll stay silent. I made sure of it." The weight of those words crashed against the defense's attempts to paint me as unstable. My journal entries were shown, pages filled with dates and details corroborated by Mr. Howard's testimony. He described what he had seen, his training as a former officer lending weight to his words. He explained how he had noticed Michael's behavior, the late-night movements, the suspicious stains. His calm voice cut through any doubt, his steady tone reinforcing the truth I had carried alone for too long. The defense tried to dismantle me. They suggested I was exaggerating, that I had motives to ruin my brother's life, that I was influenced by friends. But each attempt faltered against the recordings, the videos, the evidence piled high. When they pressed me, asking why I had not come forward sooner, I looked directly at the jury and said, "Because no one believed me. My parents called me dramatic. My father turned away. My mother told me to be quiet. But silence does not erase truth." The jury's eyes softened, some nodding subtly. In that moment, I felt power surge through me. Not the power of revenge, but the power of being heard. Michael's mask cracked during the second week of testimony. His temper flared when the prosecutor played the recording of his phone call, his voice saying, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." He slammed his hand on the table, muttering denials, and the judge reprimanded him. The jury saw what I had seen for years, the anger simmering just beneath his polished surface. Linda tried to take the stand in his defense, claiming he was a good son, that I was fragile, that stress had made me misinterpret. But under cross-examination, her contradictions piled up. When asked why she never reported the police presence outside our home, why she dismissed the flashing lights and screams, her answers faltered. The prosecutor pressed and her frustration showed. She snapped, "You don't understand our family. We protect each other." That statement meant as loyalty sounded like complicity. The judge's eyebrows rose, the jury's faces hardened. By the end of her testimony, her credibility was shattered. Richard never spoke. He sat in the gallery each day, his shoulders hunched, his silence finally a burden rather than a shield. The weeks wore on, but the case grew stronger, not weaker. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, weaving a tapestry too tight to unravel. And when closing arguments came, David Carter's voice rang through the courtroom with calm authority. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about sibling rivalry. It is not about exaggeration. It is about control, intimidation, and the courage it takes to stand against them." Anna Thompson chose not to remain silent, and because of that choice, we are here today with undeniable truth. Do not let her courage be in vain. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, my heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst. The foreperson rose, reading the verdict. Guilty on all counts of intimidation, harassment, and assault. The words struck the air like thunder. Michael's face twisted with rage, his smirk finally gone. He shouted, "Liar," his voice breaking before officers restrained him. Linda wept quietly. Richard bowed his head. I sat, frozen tears streaming, the weight of years lifting from my chest. It was done. Michael was sentenced to years in prison. Linda faced charges for obstruction, her future uncertain. Richard faded further into silence, his complicity exposed, though not criminal. The family that had caged me was finally undone, not by escape, but by truth, spoken loudly enough to be heard. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their microphones thrust forward. I shielded my face, trembling, but Sophia pressed her arm around me and whispered, "You did it." Mr. Howard's voice joined low and proud. "You stood tall, Anna. You broke the silence." That night, I returned to Sophia's apartment instead of the Thompson house. For the first time in my life, I slept without fear of footsteps in the hall, without dread of whispered threats. My dreams were still haunted, but when morning came, the sunlight felt like freedom rather than mockery. The trial had been brutal, but it was also the cleansing fire that burned away the lies. For the first time, the truth was stronger than their silence. 6 months after the trial, the world felt different, as though the colors around me had deepened, and the air itself carried a lighter weight. I no longer woke each night to the sound of footsteps that were not there, or the echo of Michael's threats rattling in my chest. The Thompson house was no longer my cage. Michael was behind bars, his arrogance finally broken by the cold reality of prison walls. Linda faced her own reckoning, charged for obstruction, and forced into community service after a plea deal. Richard remained in the old house, a man hollowed by silence, his refusal to act, finally costing him the illusion of control. For me, the future opened like a window after years sealed shut. I moved into a small apartment with Sophia, the walls painted in warm colors, the rooms filled with laughter and the clatter of textbooks. For the first time in years, I could study without fear, focusing on my nursing program, my mind free to absorb knowledge instead of rehearsing survival. Each morning I walked to class with a sense of purpose, knowing that my path belonged to me alone. Yet healing was not simple. There were days when I stood in the grocery store and caught the faint scent of cologne that reminded me of Michael, and my hands would tremble on the cart handle. Nights when a knock on the door sent my heart racing. Trauma lingered like a shadow, but it no longer controlled me. Therapy sessions helped me untangle the knots inside, and Sophia's steady presence reminded me that trust was possible. Mr. Howard remained a quiet guardian across the street. We often spoke on his porch sipping coffee as he reminded me that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. His words settled deep into me, a truth I carried every day. My involvement with a local organization for survivors of domestic abuse grew out of a desire to transform pain into purpose. I began volunteering, sharing parts of my story with women who flinched at their own memories. At first, my voice shook, but with each telling, I felt the weight lessen and the power grow. To see another woman's eyes widen with recognition, to watch her shoulders straighten as she realized she was not alone, was to witness healing multiply. My story was no longer just mine. It was a thread woven into a larger fabric of resilience. One evening after a support meeting, I returned to my apartment and stood by the window watching the city lights. I whispered into the night I survived, and I will never stay quiet again. The words no longer felt like defiance alone. They were a vow, a declaration that silence would never be my prison again. Sometimes I thought of Michael in his cell, of Linda fulfilling her service hours, of Richard sitting in the dim living room pretending life had not changed. I did not feel triumph in their downfall. What I felt was release, as though their shadows had finally detached from me. They bore their own consequences, and I bore the freedom of choosing my own life. The morning routines that once suffocated me had transformed. Instead of creeping down the stairs in fear, I now lingered over coffee planning my day. Instead of hiding evidence in secret, I now carried textbooks and journals filled with hope. Sophia often teased that our apartment was too small, but to me it felt like a palace, each corner a reminder of independence. At night, we studied together, laughter spilling between notes and diagrams, and when exhaustion took over, we collapsed on the couch with a blanket, the hum of safety surrounding us. Healing was not linear, but it was real. 6 months after the trial, I stood taller, breathed deeper, and dared to imagine the future. I knew that scars would remain etched into my memory. But scars are proof of survival, not weakness. They tell a story, one I now chose to share openly. If you are listening to this, remember that silence can be deadly, but truth spoken at the right time can save. Pay attention to the small signs, to the quiet warnings, to the instincts that whisper when something is wrong. I carry gratitude for those who stood beside me. Sophia, with her unwavering friendship, Mr. Howard, with his steady guidance, David Carter, with his clear voice in court. They reminded me that family is not always blood, that loyalty is not obedience, and that justice is possible, even against the strongest walls of denial. Now, as dawn spills light across my apartment window, I linger a little longer each morning. I brush my hair back, sip my coffee, and let the warmth remind me that each day is a gift. My life is mine again, and that is the greatest consequence of all. To those who hear this story, share your own. Do not bury your pain in silence. Speak even when your voice shakes, because truth has the power to free you.